All right, let's dive into one of the weirdest cases I've ever come across. It's a story about a plan to get a visa that spiraled into a massive legal mystery, one that forced a country's highest court to ask, what even is a marriage? And it all kicks off with a really baffling question.
I mean, seriously, think about that. It sounds like something out of a wild movie, right? Imagine you find out that according to the government, you are legally married to someone you met once in a wedding that you know for a fact never, ever happened. Well, for one woman, this wasn't a movie plot, it was a real-life legal nightmare.
And at the heart of this whole thing is a woman named Rosario Morimoto. She found herself completely stuck, legally tied to a man she barely knew, all because of a ceremony she swears was a total fiction.
So, here's how this all went down. Rosario gets introduced to this guy, Yoshio, for a very specific reason, to fake a marriage so she could get a visa for Japan. So, on December 5th, 2007, they meet up, she signs a blank marriage certificate, and she's told, don't worry, this will never be officially registered. And that's it. She never sees him again. But, sometime later, she needs to get a document proving she's single, and bam, she gets the shock of her life. That fake certificate, it had been registered, and as far as the government was concerned, she was officially Mrs. Yoshio Morimoto.
So what do? Well, you do the logical thing. She goes straight to court and says, look, this marriage isn't real. It was a sham from the start. It never actually happened. You have to declare it null and void. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Yeah, not so much. This is where the story gets really frustrating. Instead of getting a simple, quick resolution, Rosario just slams into a legal brick wall. Her request, which seems totally reasonable, gets rejected. And not just once. It gets rejected twice.
And so you have this complete deadlock. On one side, you have Rosario's reality. She's saying, there was no wedding. I never consented to this. We had zero intention of being husband and wife. But on the other side, you have the regional trial court and the Court of Appeals, and they're just looking at the paper. They see an officially registered certificate of marriage, and they basically say, sorry, paper's good, the marriage is valid.
So this just leads to the one huge question that sends this whole mess to the Supreme Court. Why on earth would the lower courts insist a marriage is real when the person in it is screaming that it was fake from the beginning? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court wanted to figure out.
So the Supreme Court steps in. They decide to cut through all the legal jargon and get to the very heart of it. They start their investigation with the absolute foundation of any marriage, of any contract, really, the question of consent.
Now, legally speaking, there are two things you absolutely have to have for a marriage to be real. First, legal capacity. You know, you're old enough and all that. But number two is the big one here, consent. And not just signing a paper. We're talking about consent that is freely given, a genuine, conscious choice to be married. And Justice Leonen, who wrote the decision, just cuts right through the whole thing with this powerful statement. He says that a marriage that's just a front, like for getting a visa, is, in the eyes of the law, totally non-existent. Why? Because the most important ingredient, that genuine desire to actually be married, was never there.
Okay, but here's the catch, right? Rosario herself admitted she was in on the plan. She agreed to fake the marriage. So why should the court believe her now? For all they know, she could just be making this up to get out of a marriage she regrets.
The court's thinking here is actually pretty brilliant. They didn't see her confession as a convenient excuse. They saw it as what the law calls an admission against interest. Think about it. By admitting she helped fake an official document, she was putting herself at risk of being charged with a crime like falsification. And the court's logic was, well, people don't usually admit to crimes unless they're telling the truth. That risk, that vulnerability, made her story incredibly believable.
But the court didn't just stop with intent. That was about the spirit of the law. They also looked at the letter of the law. If the will to marry wasn't there, what about the actual official paperwork? So their investigation turned to the marriage license itself.
And this is where Rosario presented her smoking gun. She brought in a formal certification from the exact city office that was supposed to have issued the marriage license listed on her certificate.
And boom! There it is in black and white. The civil registrar's office put it on record. They had absolutely no record of that license number ever being issued to Rosario and Yoshio. The license on the marriage certificate? It was a ghost. It pointed to nothing.
So you've got no real consent and you've got no actual license. With those two facts locked in, the Supreme Court was ready to issue its final verdict. And in doing so, they weren't just ruling on one case. They were making a huge statement about what it really means to protect the institution of marriage.
So after all the back and forth, the whole thing boiled down to just two massive, fatal flaws.
Two missing pieces that once the court saw them, proved this marriage was legally impossible from day one.
And the court's final ruling was just crystal clear. First, there was no consent. The whole thing was simulated, so the spirit of the marriage was gone. And second, there was no license, so the legal form of the marriage was also gone. When you don't have the intent or the paperwork, you don't just have a bad marriage, you have no marriage at all. It was a legal fiction.
And this is the final, powerful mic drop from the court. They're saying that the lower courts, in trying so hard to honor a piece of paper, were actually in danger of validating transactional marriages, marriages that are just business deals. They were about to become rubber stamps for fraud. And the Supreme Court basically said, no. We see the fraud, and we will not let the justice system be used to legitimize it.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating thought to chew on. This whole case forces us to ask a much bigger question. When does trying to protect an institution, by being super rigid about its rules and its paperwork, actually end up hurting the very thing you're trying to protect? It's a great reminder that sometimes seeing the truth of a situation is a heck of a lot more important than just seeing what's written on a piece of paper.